The Russian occupation of Ukraine is currently affecting the global conjuncture and global partnership relations at a historic level. While the USA against this war is a deep ally of Ukraine and the guarantor of its territorial integrity, Moscow's friend Beijing continues to pose a risk factor to the strength of international alliances such as the EU and NATO. Against this attitude of China, France, one of the EU member countries, started to seriously increase its efforts to follow the path of the USA. The approach of French leader Emmanuel Macron, the pioneer of these initiatives, received appreciation from Washington, while other EU countries described France's support of Ukraine and anti-Chinese policies as brave. France already stands out as a brave Kiev ally who has supplied Ukraine with capable systems, especially Caesar artillery, MX-10RC light tanks and air defense systems. Now, Macron's stances against Xi Jinping are far more prominent than the military and financial support provided by the Paris government to Kiev. The French leader has made very bold and striking moves in this regard, especially in the past few days. Let's take a look at French leader Emmanuel Macron's tough moves that shocked Xi Jinping and opposed Russia's support of China. Macron's recent Chinese diplomacy has clearly aided U.S. efforts to separate economically from China. French leader Emmanuel Macron made harsh rhetoric against China, just as he did with Russia. Macron has announced that he will join EU and US sanctions against the Beijing government if China blocks or attacks Taiwan. The French leader, not content with these statements, showed perhaps the clearest stance against China and Russia so far in the continuation of these statements. Macron stated that if the US enters an armed war, the French army can allocate warships or submarines for Washington in solidarity. These striking statements of Macron turned the world agenda upside down. These attitudes of the French leader Macron towards Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin gave the USA and the EU hope the most at present. The world's countries have not reacted this way in the political and diplomatic arena for a long time to Russia's policies against Ukraine and China's risking Taiwan's freedom in the Indo-Pacific maritime areas. But Macron's exemplary approach indicated that neither Ukraine nor Taiwan was alone in the world. This move was a viable and good strategy, especially for Macron, who embraced restoring glory to France, Europe, and perhaps most importantly, to the presidency. French President Emmanuel Macron's comments on his visit to China and following the US reflect Europe's multifaceted and pragmatic approach to Beijing. The United States hopes to get its partners behind it to take control of Beijing and deter it from invading Taiwan. Now, with this latest move by the French leader, Washington looks with much more confidence to China's efforts to cover up its threats. On the other hand, France had previously felt that ties within the US-led framework in the Indo-Pacific were crucial. Fearing the militarization of China in the Indo-Pacific, India and Japan sought to cooperate with their US partners like Germany and the Netherlands. France deployed its navy in the region to protect maritime trade and security. Yet as an established power, Paris has more interests in the Asia-Pacific, as 7 of its 13 overseas territories are located in the Asia-Pacific. But as a Eurocentric, rather than global middle power, France can only play a limited role in regional security and therefore still needs to cooperate with the United States. French leader Emmanuel Macron's anti-Xi and anti-Putin stances are seen as a cornerstone of this cooperation. This shows that despite playing a role in the Indo-Pacific, the Russia-Ukraine war is a priority for Europe over the militarization of Taiwan and China. Moreover, this approach may create a portrayal of Washington focusing on the Indo-Pacific, while EU states prioritize Ukraine. But one of Macron's main goals is to thwart China in order to end Russia's war in Ukraine. On the other hand, Macron inherited numerous foreign policy projects aimed at furthering France's goals of remaining a relevant independent power. Many of these initiatives have grown rapidly in recent years. One of the French leader's legacies was the de facto co-leadership of the European Union with Germany, and this was most evident in the policy nations negotiated in the first post-Brexit years. Another strategic policy approach by Paris was its engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, which would be crowned by an agreement to build traditionally powered submarines for Australia. France has island territories in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, which means it has potential security synergies with its allies in the region. But as delays and cost overruns increased, Canberra lost interest in the French deal and instead sought a counter-offer for nuclear-powered submarines from the US and UK. This situation disturbed France a little bit, but it can be predicted whether Macron's anti-Beijing stance will progress in the same way if France continues to build submarines for Australia aimed at countering Chinese naval power. In other words, in a situation where the USA and UK's support in this matter and sending submarines to Australia is not enough, France may step in because the EU and UK continue to provide significant military support to the Ukrainian army against the Russian invasion. The fact that France eases the burden of these two countries and provides military support in the Indo-Pacific plays a role both in compliance with international security norms and in helping the London-Washington governments. But the French leader Macron alone cannot organize a united Europe that takes a stand against China. For this reason, Macron should receive support from other EU member states. But EU member states are visibly divided over ties to the US and China. The Netherlands, for example, followed the US position in seeking to leave Chinese technologies such as semiconductors. Meanwhile, Poland declared its full support for the US security partnership, and Defense Minister Mariusz Błaszczak announced that Warsaw supports its military amid the security risks posed by the Russia-Ukraine war. However, there are also countries that indirectly support the expansionist policies of China and Russia. For this reason, it was the right decision for Macron to join this cooperation with his bold statements against Xi and Putin and to stand by the USA. In short, although the EU bloc supports free trade in Asia-Pacific and challenges China solely on human rights issues, individual states will continue to enjoy ties with the United States, while others will continue to individually oppose China's threat to varying degrees. In other words, although China and Russia put dangerous risk policies on the stage, international partnerships such as the EU and NATO will eventually prevent the unacceptable policies of these two countries in both Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific. On the other hand, Macron faced several domestic challenges, including mass protests against pension reform. But despite this, the French leader still has the courage to take bold steps against Russian and Chinese policies. For this reason, the approaches of other EU countries should follow Macron's footsteps. Also, in the past, Macron has resorted to the concept of leading a united Europe to secure popular support, as he did before the 2022 presidential election. At the moment, this concept of the French leader has been crowned with an acclaimed US supportive policy. We hope as soon as possible against the Ukraine and Taiwan issues. EU countries and other states in the world will adopt common and cohesion policies against the Russian and Chinese threat, just like France and the USA. 2023 brought the transition from the Western defense of Ukraine to the offensive against Russia. The struggle of the Ukrainian armed forces on the fronts continues, which is opposed to the Western-backed Kiev armed forces is not an easy task. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is grappling with several challenges, including difficulties in maintaining motivated soldiers, reports of significant casualties among his troops, and the economic fallout from Western sanctions that have allowed Ukraine to retake occupied territories. The Moscow army lacks combined arms capacity, morale, command and control, as well as logistics. And since February 24, 2022, there is nothing to suggest that the Russian occupying troops have made any significant improvement in what they have done. If 12% of Vladimir Putin's army is hastily buried in the muddy fields of Ukraine or brought home in body bags, he has only one choice: put an end to conflicts. Now, heartbreaking points continue to be experienced on the Ukrainian fronts. Russian troops continue their large-scale armed attacks on Ukraine. The enemy, without significant success on the battlefield, strikes peaceful settlements, continues to destroy the infrastructure and homes of the civilian population, violating the norms of international humanitarian law, the laws and customs of war. During the day, the Russian invaders launched 4 missile attacks that hit a civilian object in the city of Kramatorsk, Donetsk region. The main targets of these attacks were again Ukrainian civilians and the city's critical infrastructure facilities. A quick response from the Ukrainian armed forces came without delay to these attacks by the Russian occupying troops. As if in retaliation, the planes belonging to Kiev carried out 10 attacks on the areas where the personnel, weapons and military equipment of the Russian soldiers were concentrated. We also learned that the Ukrainian Air Force destroyed the Russian Su-25 close air support aircraft in these attacks. The plane, which was hit by the Ukrainian air defense elements, crashed to the ground and exploded. The heavily armored Su-25, especially as anti-tank attack aircraft, became the biggest assistant of the Moscow army units in the Ukraine war. With its attacks, the Ukrainian Air Force destroyed the Russian Su-25 air attack support aircraft and dealt a heavy hammer blow to the Russian Air Force. It is a grueling process in which no gain is experienced. On the same day, Ukrainian rocket and artillery units devastated Putin's army by hitting 2 command posts of the Russian occupying troops, an area where the Russian invaders are concentrated, an enemy ammunition depot, an electronic warfare system, and a radar system. The Ukrainian armed forces destroy an average of 500 to 800 Russian soldiers, at least 1 ammunition depot or headquarters every day. The Ukrainian Air Force carries out at least 10 airstrikes every day, while the Ukrainian armed forces fires at least 3,000 artillery shells at the front. In the face of this horrifying picture for the Russian army, especially the newly mobilized novice, Russian soldiers are psychologically collapsed as a necessary consequence of this situation. Thousands of Russian soldiers are trying every possible way to escape from Ukraine. Dozens of soldiers in the Luhansk region fled the front for their lives the other day. There are also elite Russian troops who refuse to fight due to the heavy losses they had suffered before the Russian 1st Tank Army 20th Guards, Combined Arms Army, and the Elite Marines Brigade in the Crimea refused to fight. In addition, as a result of heavy clashes in Donetsk and Luhansk in the last month, some units of the Russian 1st Corps refused to fight or fled from the front. However, despite the human and military equipment losses, Russian leader Vladimir Putin does not want to end the Ukraine war. On the contrary, Vladimir Putin is on the alert to do everything in his power to escalate this war. Mr. Putin believes that he can win a war of attrition. Russian President Vladimir Putin may soon launch another offensive against Ukraine to win the war of attrition. Vladimir Putin may renew the military might of the Moscow army by declaring a second mobilization before this attack. Putin may announce his second wave of mobilization in the coming days, possibly on January 18th, to expand his army, because January 18th coincides with the 80th anniversary of the Soviet Union breaking through the Nazi lines during the siege of the city during World War II. Russian leader Putin will speak on this date in his hometown of Leningrad. Also, Putin likes to use symbolic dates to address the Russian people. With this new Russian approach looming on the horizon, the time has come to fundamentally change the way that the US and its allies approach Ukraine. To date, the White House has carefully adjusted its military aid to allow Ukraine to fight Russian forces on Iranian soil, but not directly lead the war to Russia. The rationale for this move was to ensure Ukraine's self-defense without provoking Russia to expand its war and perhaps even use nuclear weapons. Diplomats also hope that reigning in Ukrainian resistance would give Putin a diplomatic avenue to salvage his reputation and compromise. This didn't work. Not only is Putin still making a fuss, he also interprets the US restriction as giving the green light to continue its offensive, whose ultimate goal is to wipe independent Ukraine off the map. also assuming that a new mobilization effort is more efficient than the previous one, even 25% more effective than Ukraine will soon face another attack of Russian troops. Most Russian soldiers will have weak weapons and low morale, but numbers matter. Again, all these are important details within the possibilities. If we leave the possibilities aside and look at the current situation, the Ukraine war for the moment is nothing but suffering and torment for the Russian army. In addition to his failures on the front, Vladimir Putin is struggling with economic problems. Kirill Rudik, People's Deputy of Ukraine, expressed his thoughts about the impossibility of peace negotiations while Russian forces remain in Ukraine. Kirill Rudik claimed that peace in Ukraine was possible only when Vladimir Putin could no longer bear the war and political change became necessary in Russia. In addition, Kirill Rudik noted that the sanctions imposed on the Russian Federation have really started to hit their economy, and they are losing money while Russia is dealing with financial losses. The support of NATO and Western countries is always above Ukraine. In the first weeks of 2023, NATO began promising more offensive, capable equipment in what Ukraine's Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, described as the end of the gun taboo. Instead of limiting Ukraine's arsenal to relatively short-range missiles, the United States and Western countries should allow Ukraine to attack assembly areas and pillars where Russian forces may gather with aircraft, drones, missiles, or artillery. We can say that military aid to Kiev is a key element in resolving the difficult situation in eastern Ukraine. Meanwhile, Britain has promised Leopard's sister vehicle, the Challenger 2 tanks. The US is preparing to train Ukrainians on how to use the world-famous Patriot air defense systems to end Russia's destruction of critical air defense systems. In addition, Warsaw transferred to Ukraine a significant number of Crabs, self-propelled artillery installations, and more than 260 Tesla 72 tanks of various modifications. Ukraine's Western friends are doing everything in their power to provide the necessary military equipment, but it's not possible to say the same for Russia. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is trying to lean on North Korea and Iran for dwindling ammunition reserves. But the reduction of ammunition reserves is not Putin's only problem. Vladimir Putin lost 116,950 Russian soldiers in the Ukraine war, which has been going on for about a year. The Russian leader, who is dependent on the mercenaries of the Wagner Group to make up for the loss of soldiers and revive the Moscow army, is once again in trouble. Vladimir Putin is also trying to deal with the Wagner Group leader in this process, as it is known. Yevgeny Prigozhin leads the Wagner Group, a special group of mercenaries that help the Russian army in Ukraine. It also increased tensions between the Wagner Group and the Russian soldiers, especially after Prigozhin claimed that the Wagner Group had recently captured the city of Soledar, stating that it has artillery, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and assault units of every caliber that is unique in the world. Prigozhin loudly criticized the Russian army, but Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov had to dismiss her. He claims this is a narrative and manipulation falsely spread by the media. Also, Dmitry Peskov, with an unexpected defensive tone, added that Russia should know and recognize its heroes. The Kremlin had to reject all-out internal struggle while leading the Wagner rebellion, a former Putin ally. When we look at the statements made by the Wagner Group leader and the Kremlin spokesman, there is a question mark in mind. Could Putin's chief make a bid for power in Moscow? We'll have to wait and see for that in the coming days. There are a lot of updates from the Donetsk region here. Russian forces concentrated their efforts on seizing the ground to the north of Avdiivka. Ukrainian forces had repelled major attacks on Vasil and Novobakhmutka and stabilized the front line. But Russian forces recently received substantial reinforcements and, in a new wave of attack, managed to breach the Ukrainian defense. Last time I told you that after Ukrainians managed to push Russians from Wasola back to the highway, Russians decided to switch their focus to Novobakhmutka in order to improve their tactical position relative to Ukrainian positions in Krasnohorivka. I also told you that there are attempts to conduct a mechanized assault and engulf Novobakhmutka failed because Ukrainians leveraged the heights around Alexandropol to secure their flanks. The freshest reports indicate that Russians decided to switch to frontal assaults on Krasnohorivka once again. After the previous engagements in this region, Russian forces maintained a foothold on the western side of the highway in a resumed offensive. Fierce fights broke out near the lakes around Wasola. Their plan was the same: attack Vasila in front while simultaneously moving towards the hills to hit Wasola from the back. This time, Russian forces succeeded and took control over the cellar by establishing control over these hills. Russians immediately made the eastern part of Krasnohorivka untenable. The difference in elevation here is almost 40 meters. So Ukrainians completely mined the area and moved to the central part of the village, which is located on another hill. Ukrainians have also responded to the deteriorating situation by reinforcing the Krasnohorivka group with several detachments. At first glance, it is surprising how Russian units managed to breach Ukrainian defense here after a series of defeats and sustained high losses, especially in armor. However, as it turned out, Russians have recently deployed a lot of fresh troops to the Avdiivka direction, including newly mobilized soldiers. Fresh reinforcements allowed Russian units to utilize more manpower and not be as constrained by losses as previously. Russian sources reported that their advancement inside Krasnohorivka was constrained due to mines. It looks like Ukrainians understood that once Russians secured the hills, Ukrainians would no longer have an absolute tactical advantage and prepared the outskirts of the village in advance for the Russian entrance. Ukrainian sources reported that Russians started making attempts at expanding control around Krasnohorivka, especially to the north of it. They also reported that Russians engaged their aviation much more frequently and also started conducting mechanized assaults. Geolocated footage provided by the Ukrainian 110th Mechanized Brigade shows heavy engagements of tanks and armored vehicles. It also shows how Russian infantry tried to maintain their positions in the tree lines despite constant drone and artillery fire. Unfortunately, Ukrainian positions north of Avdiivka are much less fortified than those to the south of Avdiivka, which is why Russians managed to expand their bridgehead and slowly push Ukrainians out of Krasnohorivka. The loss of Krasnohorivka is a significant development because it opens Russia's access to one of Avdiivka's supply lines. A frontal assault on Avdiivka from Krasnohorivka is not an option, so the next logical step for Russians will be an attempt to take Novokalinivka and other settlements to the north of Avdiivka. That is why Ukrainians are reportedly creating firing positions for big-caliber machine guns around Krasnohorivka. Ukrainians have also sent additional supplies and reinforcements, expecting Russian forces to try to capitalize on their recent gains and keep up the momentum of advancement. Overall, Russian forces are likely trying to exploit the excessive Ukrainian focus on Bakhmut and their preparation for a counter-offensive around Bakhmut. The best way to undermine their counter-offensive efforts would be to create problems somewhere else and force them to use their accumulated manpower to solve these problems at the expense of their main goal. Recent developments to the north of Avdiivka do not look good, although talks about the encirclement are still premature. The main supply hub of Avdiivka remains Horlivka, which is why Russians are unlikely to force Ukrainians to leave Avdiivka without achieving significant progress in the most fortified direction of this region.